Hello, this is Graham. In this video, I want to explore the nature of empathy. In a previous one, I looked at congruence, and in the future, I'll look at unconditional positive regard. People often refer to congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard as the core conditions proposed by Carl Rogers in his person-centered approach. This isn't strictly speaking accurate. Rogers didn't refer to the three as core conditions at all. He did describe what he called the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions. And sure, empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard are there. However, congruence and unconditional positive regard are actually there twice. He said that unconditional positive regard had to be shown by the therapist, and separately perceived by the client. He also said that the counsellor should be congruent, while the client should not be. They should be incongruent. So neither unconditional positive regard nor congruence are actually transmitted or received. They are, for want of a better term, attitudes. Congruence is an attitude towards oneself, while unconditional positive regard is an attitude towards other people. Empathy is the only one of the necessary and sufficient conditions that actually passes between the two people. Before we look in more detail at what empathy is, let's look at 2 other ways of relating to another human being who is incongruent. If you've ever seen 2 small tots playing, when one gets upset, if the other was responsible for the upset, then they try to distance themselves from their victim. However, if they know that they weren't responsible, they'll go straight over to the one that's upset and give them a hug. This is compassion. If you've seen or heard a charity appeal and responded by making a donation, then you've responded with compassion. If your neighbour is poorly and you offer to get them some shopping, then this too is compassion. Compassion is where we feel compelled to take some kind of action, practical or financial, to try to alleviate someone's suffering. Compassion involves conscious thought and physical action. If someone you know, but who isn't particularly close to you, has something upsetting happen, they're in a bump on the motorway, or their house purchase falls through, or they fail an exam, and so on, then we can guess how they are likely to be feeling, because we've had disappointments or upsets in the past ourselves. This is a rational process. It involves some kind of conscious thought, and this is sympathy. The closer we are to the person, the more tragic the event, the more common it is for all of us, then the time to think diminishes. But we still have to think, and this whole process is sympathy. Unlike compassion, it needn't involve any action, but both are conscious processes. Empathy is different. It doesn't involve conscious thought, and it doesn't involve any kind of action. However, it does involve subtle communication from the client to the therapist, and then from the therapist to the client. Now I want to spend a moment looking at emotion. I've promised I'll do a more detailed video about emotions, but for now you can have the quick version. Most people think that there are hundreds of different emotions. However, psychologists disagree. While it's evolved a bit, our model of emotions today emanates from an American professor, Robert Plutchik, who in 1980 published a groundbreaking book on the evolutionary significance of emotions. He demonstrated that there were only 8 primary ones, and that all other emotions could be regarded as a combination of these. He provided a graphic model to make this clearer still, known as Plutchik's wheel. For the time being, try to remember these 8 primary emotions: joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. We've all experienced them. Obviously, to some of us, some will be more significant, but it would be unusual for someone not to have encountered each of them at some time. Outside the psychology and zoology fields, few people realise that it was Charles Darwin who painstakingly documented the means by which emotions are communicated, right down to the tiniest little muscle twitch beneath an eye and so on. And he did this not just for humans, but throughout the vertebrate kingdom. His meticulous work was published almost 150 years ago in 1872, and other than relatively minor tweaks, has not been improved since. If anything, our tools to measure the minutiae have become more sophisticated, so we now know that the process is even more complex, even including minuscule changes in heart rate visible as a quiver in the neck, or the faintest puff of a pheromone. What Darwin and Plutchik were establishing is that emotions have evolutionary significance. The ability to recognize and understand them is of survival importance to all, both man and other animals. But emotions are usually seen as an internal mental model, not something that can be easily heard or seen and interpreted without much difficulty. Unlike words or gross gestures, which can usually be read quite easily. While Darwin documented the many minute bits of facial expression and skin changes associated with them, being able to read and understand these calls for a significant specialized mental process. And that process is what Rogers described as empathy. As a mechanism, empathy is quite easy to imagine, if only the details weren't so darn tiny and complex. Just look at one example. At some point in my past, probably as a child, I've experienced anticipation. As children, the experience of emotions often lacks the social constraints that they do as adults. So I really experienced anticipation, eagerly awaiting the nourishment of my mother's breast, or the safety of my father's presence, the shape of my bicycle wrapped ridiculously in birthday paper, the touch of the lips of the first person that I kissed, and so on. While some of the signals that I was giving out of my anticipation might have been rather gross, in the big sense of the word, most were actually quite subtle, and my mind learnt them. So when it was my brother or sister's or best friend's birthday, and they were experiencing that overload of anticipation, I could read in their expressions and little changes in skin tone, breathing rate, moisture on their brow, or whatever, that emotion. We don't have to have had the same experience to be able to read the emotional signals. But for survival to happen, I have to read the individual fast, very fast, far too fast for this to be a rational, conscious, thought-through response. And it has to be appropriate. This is less important when you're waiting for a birthday present to be unwrapped, but it's of critical importance when you're about to be attacked or cheated upon. In those cases, I may need to respond in like manner, meeting aggression with aggression, or in a way that de-escalates the situation, meeting aggression with submission, for example. This is where Plutchik's wheel, with its basic emotions and the primary dyads formed by combinations of emotions, is helpful for us to understand what might be going on. So what is the mechanism that works unconsciously, almost literally at the speed of light, that allows us to observe the emotion in the person in front of us, to decide on the right strategy to respond, and then to make those signals back? It is, of course, empathy. So yes, it could be considered as a form of communication. It's a kind of language, but it is so complex and with so many variables, and it depends on two people having the same code book to make it work. It's probably best envisaged as two people sitting in two different parts of space, light years apart. One sends out signals in the hope that someone somewhere will receive them. Those other beings are doing the same thing at the same time. The signals pass each other somewhere in between. For most people, this isn't something that you can consciously turn on or off. It isn't something that you can take steps to use. I am going to demonstrate empathy to this person or that. It's largely genetically transmitted, that's the code book, and then fine-tuned by experience. There are only two professions that I'm aware of that proactively try to teach their practitioners to develop and draw on their empathy. There's a third just coming on board recently. The counselling and psychotherapy profession, the acting profession, and recently the medical one. Psychotherapy training aims to develop the empathy of its students by providing many opportunities for them to experience emotions in a semi-controlled environment, and then encouraging them to reflect on the experience. Method acting training and rehearsal is an intense process that aims to draw on the actor's previous emotional experiences and heighten their unconscious use of the visual and voice cues that will stimulate an appropriate empathic response in the audience. Medics are a little behind the game. The placebo effect has been known since at least 1811. For a long time, the use of placebos has been subject to all kinds of ethical challenge. In the last 20 years, however, it's been shown that the therapeutic relationship, widely recognised as significant in talking therapies, is also profoundly important in other areas of medicine. For physicians to give it respect, they have to see the use of it as part of their job, not merely a nice to have. To this end, developing the therapeutic relationship has been characterised as emotional labour. The clinical setting rarely allows much rehearsal time, and it depends on a swift connection which may lead to a longer-term relationship later. Students are therefore being encouraged to take courses that are based on method acting to develop a deeper understanding of themselves, to enable them to access their empathic responses with patients, while also practicing what is known as surface acting to build the initial rapport. So to try to summarise quickly, there are a limited number of primary emotions which we have all experienced at some time in our lives. Emotions themselves are internal, but they are communicated in a myriad of ways, ranging from sounds to visual cues and olfactory stimuli. The production of and response to these are unconscious processes based on our prior experience of the emotions, even if the circumstances in which we encountered them were very different. These processes are known collectively as empathy and are quite different from sympathy and compassion. We can develop our empathic processes over a relatively long time. Thus, some individuals are more empathic than others and will be perceived as such even by an unsuspecting and untrained client. Being an unconscious means of receiving, processing and responding at an emotional level, we cannot selectively be empathic towards someone or even be aware that we are showing them empathy. It is possible to feel empathy for someone's emotional state, but not for someone specifically. I hope that helps make sense of what is definitely one of the most complex concepts in psychotherapy and counselling. Thank you.